everyone. Thank you for having me. I hope everyone can hear me. How to respond to a lot of this. First of all, on the bar, you said you admitted yourself that the bar had been set quite high. I would suggest, though, that the burden of proof is on the proposer rather than on us. It quite clearly says Islam is a religion of peace. I suggest you prove it. We've also been told here tonight when we opened that this debate must take place in the real world. Well, absolutely, yes, it must. It must take place in the real world. And I will describe what Islam is doing in the real world. We can sit and we can debate theocracy day in, day out. We will never agree. We can debate, is there a God, isn't there a God, is the Quran real, isn't it? None of it actually matters. What matters is what happens in the real world, as my opponent quite rightly said. My side of the argument is regularly told that we've heard it again tonight, we were described somewhat as hate. We were told that we are demonizing Islam, whipping up fear of Islam. Not the first time I've been accused of this, probably won't be the last. But let me just say, and let's take this into the real world as we've been advised to do. Let me tell you what actually whips up fears of Islam. We take it from the top. 9/11, the London Underground bombings, Madrid, Mumbai, Mali, Bali, northern Nigeria, Sudan, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yemen, Pakistan, death for apostasy, death for blasphemy, death for adultery, death for homosexuality, gender segregation, gender discrimination, unequal testimony between men and women in legal proceedings, child marriage, amputations, beheadings, imprisonment for being raped, anti-Semitism, burqas, execution, as I've said, for this, that and the other, the slaughter of Theo van Gogh on the streets of Amsterdam, death threats on the streets of London, butcher those who insult Islam, Muslim patrols in East London telling people they are entering Sharia control zones, polygamous marriages, marriage not requiring the consent of the bride. This is what causes fear of Islam. It is not me, it is not my colleagues on this side.
Point of information on that point. If Islam and Muslims are responsible for the Muslim patrols,
I'm not finished. I'm not. No, okay, I'm not. I mean, let me speak on. But the point is that it is not I or my fellow debaters on this side who are causing fear of Islam. It is the actions of Muslims that are causing fear of Islam. That is the real world. That is where we actually live. Then we'll be told that this is just the extreme fringe of Islam. Well, let me have a look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam, the custodian of its holy sites. In Saudi Arabia, a woman is not allowed to drive. She is not allowed to leave the house without a mahram. She is not allowed to vote, although they've been incredibly generous by allowing some votes in the next elections. This is apparently the extreme fringe of people are executed for blasphemy, executed for apostasy. In Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, we'll be told that's the extreme fringe of Islam. No, it is not. Calling Saudi Arabia the extreme fringe of Islam is like calling the Vatican the extreme fringe of Catholicism. Sorry, it just doesn't work. Then we'll be told that we've misunderstood. Violent Muslims have misunderstood. Saudi Arabia has misunderstood. Iran, which stones people to death for adultery, has misunderstood. Yemen, which marries children at the age of 9, has misunderstood. Has there ever been a more spectacularly misunderstood religion than Islam? It seems that these nations who apply it as their laws, nations which have the Quran as their constitution, innumerable nations, where there is no free speech, where there is no freedom of religion, they've all got it wrong. They've all got it wrong. It's quite a spectacularly misunderstood religion. There's just so much. I'm constantly told as well that I need to respect Islam. I'm never quite given a good enough reason why. I am under no greater obligation to respect Islam than I am any other beliefs. I'm under no more obligation to respect a woman oppressed in the name of Islam than if she is oppressed by the BNP or anyone else. I am under no obligation to make compromises with an ideology I simply don't see as peaceful. Why don't I see it as peaceful? Because of the evidence. If I look around the world and I see the countries where Islam calls the shots, all I see is brutality and violence imposed by the state. We were told that peace is not just the absence of violence but the presence of justice. Absolutely. I do not see how in a nation where, as the only woman here, I have some particular issues with the way women are treated in Islamic states. Now you can argue that they've got it wrong. Tell them that, because they seem to think that's what it is. Yes, I mean, there's so much to say about it, but is there a peaceful Islam? Yes, there is. It's in the hearts of peaceful Muslims. Unfortunately, though, there's also a rather more objective Islam, and peaceful Muslims have to do some really rather creative interpretation, like the command to beat her. I've seen Muslim women. I didn't stand up for you.
You're allowed to.
Well, I didn't. So if you could just have it. But I knew this would happen. I knew this would happen, by the way. I knew this would happen. What I'm saying is completely controversial and will be booed and shouted down, and I have no doubt my colleagues the same. I knew this would happen. You say anything negative, you'll get the boos. I'm actually going to leave it there. But I will finish just by saying this. There are hundreds of millions of peaceful Muslims. That is a fact. But that does not mean that Islam itself is peaceful. Peaceful Muslims interpret verses of the Quran so almost beyond recognition it's reinterpreted. Like the command to beat her. It's there in the Quran, and I've seen Muslim women try to dance around it. They put words in there that simply aren't there. That's what it says. It says beat her. And in the countries where the Quran calls the shots, that is exactly what they do. This is not peace. This is not justice. Islam is not a religion of peace, as the evidence shows us. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My role this evening will be to present a theological understanding of Islam that the vast majority of Muslims believe and also practice. Now, it's quite easy to assume from the sensationalist headlines that the very idea of speaking about Islam and peace seems nonsensical. After all, a week doesn't go by without an extremist Muslim hitting the headlines. And this evening, our esteemed speakers arguing for the opposition are going to paint this sinister picture, referring to the usual polemics, and we had a taste of that so far. But what I would say is that in order to assess the debate this evening effectively, we must distinguish the Muslim, the imperfect practitioner, from Islam, the spiritual message and the ethical ideals they're meant to adhere to. And also what I would say is that we must allow Islam to define itself. Not Saudi Arabia, not all these horrible places that were mentioned. We must allow Islam to define itself and also assess how Islam views itself in entirety. So this evening, in support of the proposition, I want to put forward 2 points. The first is that the entire corpus of the spiritual teachings abhors violence and places primacy on the very values that underpin peaceful coexistence. Now, before we entertain the topic, it's important that we define the terms at hand. Often when we speak of peace, what we mean is the absence of violence, the cessation of hostilities. And yet, when we look at locations where peace agreements have been signed, it is clear that the end of conflict does not in and of itself bring about peace. Tensions, hostilities, discrimination, hate can subsist in these situations even though there is this thing called peace, namely in the sense that there is absence of conflict. Thus, philosophers reflecting on peace have, on the concept of peace, distinguished between negative peace, which is the absence of war, and positive peace. Now, positive peace seeks to bring about those conditions that resolve those underlying factors that bring about conflict and also violence. Betty R. Reardon, for example, identifies that justice is a central concept of positive peace. She says, justice, in the sense of the full enjoyment of entire range of human rights by all people, is what constitutes positive peace. Ladies and gentlemen, if we approach the Quran, if we approach the Islamic teaching fairly and objectively, what we will find is that there is a golden thread that runs throughout the entire fabric of the message, and that is justice. That is justice, ladies and gentlemen. The one who engages with the Quran objectively and fairly is confronted with the many, many verses, approximately 50 verses talking about justice. Here's one. O you who believe, uphold justice and bear witness to God, even if it is against yourselves, your parents, your close relatives, whether the person is rich or poor. Refrain from following your desires so that you can act justly. On the topic of positive peace, many writers have argued that in order to have positive peace, this profound level of peace, there must be harmonious relationships with the individual and the other and groups. And what is outlined here is that, and something that Matthew also mentioned, is that we have something called inner peace. That the individual must have peace within themselves. And this is precisely why Islam does not just avoid violence, but it also lays a foundation for a profound societal peace, premised on the idea of individual discipline, cultivation of qualities deemed essential for coexistence: humility, control of anger, kindness, empathy, and compassion. So what we find, like all great traditions, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam as well, instills in the believer those qualities that are important for coexistence. Point number 2, that the Islamic injunctions pertaining to war are ethically and morally justified. Now, an often criticism of Islam not being a religion of peace, some argue that it can't be a religion of peace because the Quran entertains verses of violence. It talks about entering into war and so forth. But the problem with this objection is that it simply lacks any merit because it presupposes pacifism. And if the opposition want to take that line of attack, they must demonstrate this evening that pacifism is morally justified. They must demonstrate that. Let's not be fooled this evening. That needs to be demonstrated. And I would argue that pacifism is a morally indefensible position, the idea of showing blindness to conflict and at the expense of upholding justice. Now, Islam is compatible with violence, but it is not identical to violence, which is often put forward by Islamophobes and Islam critics. The Quran warns against an enthusiasm for war. Often, what we find is that these verses that the Quran speaks about, warning against war, are completely ignored. The Quran says, fighting is prescribed for you, though you may dislike it. Now, this aversion to fighting is seen as a virtue, but it must not manifest into moral cowardice. It must not manifest into moral cowardice. So what we find is that the Quran is unequivocal about oppression. We must not show a blindness to other people's suffering, a moral imperative which underpins a profound ethics of peace. Thus, the virtue of an aversion to violence, fighting, is superseded by the virtue of upholding justice. Moreover, I will also argue that the Islamic injunctions pertaining to violence, pertaining to war, fall well within our Western concept of just war theory. Now, according to Mark Evans from the University of Wales, Yusad Bellum consists of the right to engage into war, and also all attempts must be exhausted in peaceful means to avoid conflict. Yusam Bello is the discrimination in the selection of targets, proportionality, and the just treatment of prisoners. And what we find is that the Quran, the Islamic verses pertaining to war, fall within those categories. For example, God says in the Quran, those who have been attacked are permitted to take up arms because they have been wronged. God has the power to help them. Those who have been driven unjustly from their homes only for saying, our Lord is God. If God did not repel some people by means of others, many monasteries, churches, synagogues, mosques, people see that as being justice, where God's name is much involved, would have been destroyed. What about peace? Here we go. And if they incline to peace, then incline to it also. Rely upon God. Indeed, it is he who is hearing and knowing. Clearly falls within those categories. What about Yusimbello? The conditions within war. The Prophet is known to have said that engaging in war, he would say, do not kill children, women, elderly, the sick. Do not practice treachery, mutilation. Do not uproot trees. Do not slaughter sheep, camels, except for food. And what about the criteria of proportionality? Does Islam engage in a disproportionate mode of violence? Not at all. Fighting God's cause, those who fight you, but do not overstep the limits. And God does not love those who overstep the limits. What about the treatment on prisoners? The Prophet, peace be upon him, is known for treating his prisoners of war kindly. He even said that if you eat one morsel of food, please give that to your prisoner. To the extent that he gave a greater portion of food to his prisoners. And they were so embarrassed by the kindness, they couldn't even accept the offering. So, to conclude, Islam is a religion of peace for two reasons. The first, that the central message of Islam is justice, and it instills in individuals those essential qualities for peaceful coexistence. And secondly, that the Islamic injunctions pertaining to war fall within just war theory. Thank you for listening.
Ladies and gentlemen, I very nearly decided not to come today. Yesterday, a British soldier was decapitated in cold blood on the streets of London by Islamists shouting Allahu Akbar. One of them told the British public, "You people will never be safe." Why should I, a married father of 4, take the risk of questioning the religion of peace at a public debate that will be filmed and no doubt appear on the internet? I have met Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was forced to live in hiding and then to leave Europe after her friend Theo van Gogh suffered the same fate as the soldier in Amsterdam. I have met the historian Benny Morris, who was assaulted outside the London School of Economics by Muslim students merely because he was an Israeli. I have British friends who have been forced to move to a secure gated refuge because of similar threats. But I have come precisely because I do not want to live in fear in a free country, our country. I do not want this great university, our university, to become a place where academics are intimidated. I do not want free speech to die in the land that gave this most precious of liberties to the rest of the world, including many of the 56 states that call themselves Islamic. I do not want Muslim women to endure domestic tyranny. The Pew survey reveals that more than 90% of the world's 1.5 billion Muslims believe that wives must always obey their husbands. 90%. Earlier today, I attended the funeral of a dear friend, Professor Geza Vermes, a man whose remarkable career shows what freedom means and why we must fight to preserve it here in Oxford. It was only because he, unlike his parents, survived the Holocaust in Hungary that he ever came here to found the discipline of Jewish studies. Geza was hidden from the Nazis by the church and after the war became a Catholic priest. But later he criticized the church's attitude to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which he insisted should be made available to the academic world regardless of their implications for the origins of Christianity. Indeed, he became a leading expert and was the first to translate them into English. Later, he left the priesthood to get married and decided to revert to his Jewish roots. Here in Oxford, Geza began to investigate what he called the Jewish Jesus, not the Son of God or even the founder of Christianity, but a charismatic Jewish preacher. Geza challenged Christian orthodoxy at every point, though just before he died he also shocked Orthodox rabbis by showing in an article for Standpoint the not very right-wing magazine that I edit, that crucifixion had been used by Jewish rulers as well as Roman ones. With a foot in both Jewish and Christian camps, but beholden to neither, Geza enlarged our knowledge of the world of Jesus more than anybody else in our time. I've dwelt on his career, the career of Geza Vermes, for one simple reason. None of it would have been possible in any Islamic country. His change of religion would have been treated as apostasy, despite the fact that the Quran suggests only that an apostate will suffer in the next world. Under Sharia law, it is a capital offence, and many Muslim-majority countries do in fact impose the death penalty. The latest Pew survey suggests that a majority of Muslims around the world agree with this draconian punishment. Even worse in the eyes of Islamic authority was Geza Vermes's investigation of Jesus. If he had attempted to apply the same modern scholarly methods to the Prophet Muhammad in an Islamic country, he would certainly have been executed for blasphemy as a non-Muslim or for apostasy if he had been a Muslim. One recent example was a leading Islamic scholar in Sudan, Mahmoud Taha, who was executed for apostasy merely because he presented Islam as a religion of peace, drawing on Muhammad's more conciliatory sayings rather than the warlike doctrines he later adopted. Not only would an open-minded intellectual like Geza Vermes have no place in an Islamic country, but a university like Oxford, in which liberty of research into everything, including Islam, is not merely permitted but obligatory, could not exist. There are no universities in this sense in the Muslim world, and the academic study of Islam, and especially of its founder, has been greatly inhibited by the suppression of free intellectual inquiry. Now, how does this lack of free speech and inquiry bear on the question we are debating tonight? In my view, it is crucial. Islam has the potential to be a religion of peace. No, sorry, I'm not taking points of information. But it will need to evolve a great deal if it is actually to become a religion of peace. Islam cannot evolve unless Muslim authorities, both religious and secular, allow the freedoms we in the West take for granted. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience. Of course, these freedoms go together with other basic principles which are absent in those countries. Equality before the law, civil and political rights, constitutional democracy, economic liberty, the separation of church or mosque and state. All these ideas emerged in the West because the Judeo-Christian tradition has always evolved in classical and medieval, Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, and it is still evolving today. As a Catholic, I must acknowledge that it is only in my lifetime that the Church adapted its teaching on the Jews from enemies to brothers. And in order to ensure that the 1.2 billion Catholics could see that the Church banished anti-Semitism in its practice as well as its preaching, successive popes have gone out of their way to reach out to Jewish people. How very different is the situation in Islam. Where Jews and Christians have allowed the reinterpretation of the Bible, Muslim scholars have insisted that the Quran, as the unmediated word of Allah, cannot be reinterpreted. Despite this rigidity, Islam did evolve in its early centuries, but since the medieval period, it has undergone successive waves of fundamentalism intended to restore the faith to its original purity and to impose it, if necessary by force, on the rest of the world. We are living through such a wave today, which includes the Wahhabi and Salafist branches of Sunni and the Iranian-inspired Shia Islam. The overall name we give to these movements is Islamism, or radical Islam. Rather than emphasize the earlier, more pacific elements in Muhammad's teaching, such as his Constitution of Medina, which granted equal rights to Jews, Christians and pagans, Islamists emphasize later doctrines, such as the division of the world into the Dar'ul Islam and the Dar'ul Harb, the House of Islam and the House of War. We are living apparently in the House of War. Or the draconian enforcement of Sharia law. Not content with the attempt to convert non-Muslims, Islamists stress the obligation to carry out jihad, understood to mean holy war, including terrorism. As we saw yesterday in Woolwich, or a few weeks ago in Boston, radical Islam is not only a threat in the Muslim world, but also here in our midst. It is, in fact, the most direct threat to Western civilization in the world today. It is not enough No, I'm sorry. It is not enough for Muslim apologists to point to statements of regret after terrorist attacks. They have to acknowledge the truth about their own past and present, the discrimination and cruelty towards non-Muslims, women and slaves that have characterized Islam from its inception. Mehdi Hasan is an exception. I'm sorry. In a brave and remarkable article in the New Statesman, he revealed what he called our dirty little secret, that anti-Semitism in the Muslim community is, quote, routine and commonplace, unquote. It was brave because Muslims have reason to fear reprisals when they speak out, and it was remarkable because most Muslims are in denial, encouraged by the pernicious notion of Islamophobia. Because of that notion, the police and other authorities were in denial about the rape and exploitation of girls here in Oxford, an evil that was only exposed at their recent trial. But what other dirty little secrets might Mehdi Hasan like to admit? Who else are Muslims, at least of the radical persuasion, inclined to denounce in private? What do they say about Christians and other non-Muslims, including atheists? What about homosexuals or women whose dress or behavior is un-Islamic? We know what Islamic states do to all these and many other categories of people. They persecute and kill them. They claim the authority of Islam, of the Quran, the Hadith, the Sharia, and their own leading scholars. I know there are other scholars who defy the Islamists. I had the honor of meeting the late Zaki Badawi, the founder of the Muslim College, who fought against the influx of Saudi-funded imams into British mosques, who fought for Muslim integration and who denounced the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. But, I'm sorry, Badawi lost all these battles. His leadership role has been usurped by Tariq Ramadan, who occupies a chair here in Oxford. He comes from a very different tradition, that of the Muslim Brotherhood, the vanguard of Islamism. To be blunt, Professor Ramadan is an Islamist wolf in sheep's clothing. Beware of him. A religion of peace has to practice what it preaches. I'm almost done. You only have to watch the news of persecution, war and terror from the Muslim world and beyond to find that religion of peace rings hollow. Peace is not on offer to the rest of us except at a price that is unacceptable. The price of submission to the Islamists who increasingly dominate their fellow Muslims across the globe. One of the Woolwich terrorists told onlookers he had committed his carnage because he wanted to bring our troops back so we can all live in peace. Our troops? He had just butchered one of them. That is not only murder, that is treason. Until it is purged of the radicals who preach in its name, until we can feel safe on our streets again, Islam does not deserve to call itself a religion of peace. I urge you to oppose this motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Lovely to see you all here tonight. We are having a very entertaining night, are we not, with some very interesting things being said from the other side of the house tonight. Let me begin by saying, as a Muslim, as a representative of Islam, I would consider myself an ambassador for Islam, a believer in Islam, a follower of Islam and its Prophet. So in that capacity, let me begin by apologizing to Anne-Marie for the Bali bombings. I apologize for the role of my religion and me and my people, for the killing of Theo van Gogh, for 7/7. Yes, that was all of us. That was Islam, that was Muslims, that was the Quran. I mean, astonishing claims to make in the very first speech tonight, on a day like today, where the Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is having to come out and point out that these kind of views are anathema. And I believe you're trying to stand for the Labour Party to become an MP in Brighton. If you do, and you make these comments, I'm guessing you'll have the whip withdrawn from you, but then again, UKIP's on the rise, they'll take you, the BNP, they might have something to say about your views.
This is what Mehdi Hasan always does.
By the way, just on a factual point, since we heard a lot about the second speaker, about how backward we Muslims all are, on a factual point, you said that Islam was born in Saudi Arabia. Islam was born in 610 AD. Saudi Arabia was born in 1932 AD. So you were only 1,322 years off. Not bad? Not bad start there. Talking of maths, by the way, A man named Al-Khwarizmi was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, a Muslim, worked in the golden age of Islam. He's the guy who came up with not just algebra, but algorithms. Without algorithms, you wouldn't have laptops. Without laptops, Daniel Johnson tonight wouldn't have been able to print out his speech in which he came to berate us Muslims for holding back the advance and intellectual achievements of the West, which all happened without any contribution from anyone else other than the Judeo-Christian people of Europe. In fact, Daniel David Levering, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and author of The Golden Crucible, points out that there would be no Renaissance, there would be no Reformation in Europe without the role played by Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and some of the great Muslim theologians, philosophers, scientists in bringing Greek texts to Europe. As for this being our university, I will leave that to the imagination as to who is our and who is there. I studied here too. An astonishing set of speeches so far making this case tonight. A mixture of just cherry-picked quotes, facts and figures, self-serving, selective, a farrago of distortions, misrepresentations, misinterpretations, misquotations. Daniel talked about my article in the New Statesman, which got me a lot of flack, where I talked about the anti-Semitism that is prevalent in some parts of the Muslim community, which indeed it is. Of course, I didn't say in that piece that it was caused by the religion of Islam. In fact, modern anti-Semitism in the Middle East was imported from, finish the sentence, Christian, Judeo-Christian Europe, where I believe some certainly bad things happened to the Jewish people. In fact, Tom Friedman, Jewish-American columnist in the New York Times, told me in this very chamber last week that he believed, had Muslims been running Europe in the 1940s, 6 million extra Jews would still be alive today. So I'm not going to take lessons in anti-Semitism from someone who's here to defend the Judeo-Christian values of a continent that murdered 6 million Jews. Moving swiftly on. Yes.
You're doing exactly what.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm about to make that point. No, I'm about to make that point. You're right. I agree with you. I agree with you 110%. That is my point. I don't think Europe is evil or bad. I'm a very proud European. I don't want to judge Europe on that basis, but if we're going to play this gutter game where we pull out the Bali bombing and we pull out examples of anti-Semitism in the Islamic community, then of course I'm going to come back and say, well, hold on. I mean, look, let's be very clear. Daniel here was a last-minute replacement for Douglas Murray, who had to pull out. And Douglas and I have a well-documented differences, but to be fair to Douglas, as to be fair to Anne-Marie and to Peter, atheists. Atheists see all religions as evil, violent, threatening. What the problem I have with Daniel's speech is that Daniel comes here to run this robust defense of Christianity, forgetting that his fellow Christians, people who said they were acting in the name of Jesus, gave us the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the anti-Jewish pogroms, European colonialism in Africa and Asia, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, not to mention countless arson and bomb attacks on abortion clinics in the United States of America to this very day. I would like a little bit of humility from Daniel first before he begins lecturing other communities and other faiths on violence, terror and intolerance. But, no thank you. Take some water. But I would say this, to address the gentleman's very valid point here, I'm not going to play that game. I don't actually believe that Christianity is a religion of violence and hate because of what the LRA does in Uganda or what Crusaders did to Jews and Muslims in Jerusalem when they took back the city in the 12th or 13th or whatever century it was. I believe that Christianity, like Islam, like pretty much every mainstream religion, is based on love and compassion and faith. I do follow a religion in which 113 out of the 114 chapters of the Quran begins by introducing the God of Islam as a God of mercy and compassion. I would not have it any other way. I don't follow a religion which introduces my God to me as a God of war, as some kind of Greek God of wrath, as a God of hate and injustice. Not at all. As Adam pointed out, you go through the Quran and you see the mercy and the love and the justice. And yes, you have verses that refer to warfare and violence. Of course it does. This is not a motion about pacifism. I'm not here to argue that Islam is a pacifistic faith. It is not. Islam allows military action, violence in certain limited contexts. And yes, a minority of Muslims do take it out of that context. But is it religious? We talked about Woolwich. Daniel and Anne-Marie have suggested that it's definitely religion that's behind all of this. Well, actually, what I find so amusing tonight is we're having a debate about Islam. And the opposition tonight have come forward. We have a graduate in law, a graduate in modern history, a graduate in chemistry. And you know, I admire all of their intellects and their abilities, but we don't have anyone who's actually an expert on Islam, a scholar of Islam, a historian of Islam, a speaker of Arabic, even a terrorism expert or a security expert or a pollster, let alone to talk about what Muslims believe or think. Instead, we have people coming here, putting forward these views, putting forward these sweeping opinions. Listen to Professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago, one of America's leading terrorism experts, who, unlike our esteemed opposition tonight, studied every single case of suicide terrorism between 1980 and 2005, 315 cases in total. And he concluded, and I quote, "There is little connection between suicide terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism or any of the world's religions. Rather, what nearly all suicide terrorist attacks have in common is a specific secular and strategic goal to compel modern democracies to withdraw military forces from territory that the terrorists consider to be their homeland." And the irony is, when we talk about terrorism, the irony is that the opposition and the Muslim terrorists, the Al-Qaeda types, actually have one thing in common. Because they both believe that Islam is a warlike, violent religion. They both agree on that. They have everything in common. Osama bin Laden would be nodding along to everything he's heard tonight from the opposition side. He agrees with them. The problem is that mainstream Muslims don't. The majority of Muslims around the world don't. In fact, a gentleman here started quoting all sorts of polls. Gallup carried out the biggest poll of Muslims around the world, of 50,000 Muslims in 35 countries. 93% of Muslims rejected 9/11 and suicide attacks. And of the 7% who didn't, they all, when polled and focus grouped, cited political reasons for their support for violence, not religious reasons. And as for Islamic scholars and what they say, well, Daniel talks about our University of Oxford. We'll go down to Oxford's Centre for Islamic Studies, get hold of a man named Sheikh Afifi al-Akiti, who is a massively well-credentialed and well-respected Islamic scholar, who has studied across the world, who in the days after 7/7 published a fatwa denouncing terrorism in the name of Islam, calling for the protection of all non-combatants at all times, and describing suicide bombings as an innovation with no basis in Islamic law. Go and listen to Sheikh Tahir al-Qadri, one of Pakistan's most famous Islamic scholars, who published a 600-page fatwa condemning the killing of all innocents and all suicide bombings unconditionally without any ifs or buts. There's nothing new here. This is mainstream Islam, mainstream scholarship, which has said this for years. You don't go out and kill people willy-nilly in the high street or anywhere else, on a bus or a mall, based on verses of the Quran that you cherry-pick without any context, any understanding, any interpretation, or any commentary.
Point of information.
Please. Well, it
doesn't happen apparently.
I didn't say it doesn't happen at all. I never said it didn't happen. I don't blame Islam. Yes, it's a very good point. And a lot of us are campaigning against that. And we're campaigning against it in the name of Islam. We're campaigning against it in the name of various interpretations of Islam. Anne-Marie comes and scares us with her talk of Sharia law. I would like to see the book of Sharia law. It doesn't exist. People argue over what Sharia law is. And you empower the extremists by saying there is only one version. You empower them all. I don't believe you took any interruptions, Anne-Marie, so I think you should stay there for a moment.
Several countries.
Here's what we're dealing with. Here's what we're dealing with. We are dealing, I took your point. Here we are dealing with a 1400-year-old global religion, followed by 1.6 billion people in every corner of the world, a quarter of humanity, of all backgrounds, cultures, ethnicities. And yet the opposition tonight wants to generalize, stereotype, smear in order to desperately win this debate. And here's my question, if we're going to generalize and smear. If, okay, people say yesterday's bombers, and we've got to be careful, there's a trial going on, were yesterday's attackers, motivated by Islam? Big debate. I don't believe they were. Let's say they were. Let's say Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, was motivated by Islam. Let's assume, for sake of argument, that Richard Reeves, the shoe bomber, was motivated by Islam. If Islam is responsible for these killings, if Islam is what is motivating these people, and Islam is therefore not a religion of peace, a religion of war, then ask yourself this question: why aren't the rest of us doing it? Why is it such a tiny minority of Muslims are interpreting their religion in the way that the opposition claim they are? Let's assume there are 16,000 suicide bombers in the world. There aren't. Let's assume there are for the sake of argument. That's 0.001% of the Muslim population globally. What about the other 99.99% of Muslims who the opposition tonight either ignore or smear? The reality is that the rest of us aren't blowing ourselves up tonight. The reality is that the opposition came here tonight not worried about the fact that me and Adam might pull open our jackets and blow ourselves up tonight because we're followers of a warlike warrior religion which wants to take over Europe and Daniel's university. The issue is this. The issue is this. the opposition can tell us tonight, and Peter Atkins is here, one of our great atheist intellectuals, can tell us tonight, can answer this question tonight, why don't the vast majority of Muslims around the world behave as violently and aggressively as a tiny minority of politically motivated extremists? Then they might as well give up and stop pretending they have anything relevant to say about Islam or Muslims as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just say this to you. Think about what the opposite of this motion is. If you vote no tonight, think about what you're saying the opposite of this motion is. That Islam isn't a religion of peace, it's a religion of war, of violence, of terror, of aggression. That the people who follow Islam, me, my wife, my retired parents, my 6-year-old child, that 1.8 million of your fellow British residents and citizens, that 1.6 billion people across the world, your fellow human beings, are all followers, promoters, believers in a religion of violence. Do you really think that? Do you really believe that to be the case? They say that in the Oxford Union, the most famous debate was in 1933 when Adolf Hitler looked out for the result of the King and Country motion, where they voted against fighting for king and country, and Hitler was listening out for the result. Well, tonight, 80 years on, there are two groups of people around the world who I would argue are waiting for the result of tonight's vote. There are the millions of peaceful, non-violent, law-abiding Muslims both in the UK, Europe, Asia, Africa and beyond, who see Islam as the source of their identity, as a source of spiritual fulfillment, of hope, of solace. And there are the phobes, the haters, the bigots out there who want to push the clash of civilizations, who want to divide all of us into them and us and ours and their. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you all not to fuel the arguments of the phobes and bigots. Don't legitimize their divisions. Don't legitimize their hate. Trust those Muslims who you know, who you've met, who you hear, who don't believe in violence, who do want you to hear the peaceful message of the Quran as they believe it to be taught to the majority of Muslims. The Islam of peace and compassion and mercy. The Islam of the Quran, not of Al-Qaeda. Ladies and gentlemen, I beg to propose this motion to the House. I urge you to vote yes tonight. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, that was a really hard act to follow. It is my duty, I think, this evening to try to respond to some of the challenges that have been put forward by the proposers, such as us not being particularly philosophical about the approach to Islam, us taking particular instances and ignoring the whole. So my job this evening, I think, is to be reflective. And it is also, I think, my job this evening to be conciliatory. I hate being conciliatory, but I'm going to try to be conciliatory this evening. But nevertheless, I will stand by opposition totally to the motion this evening. I'll begin by admitting that there is indeed a great deal of good in Islam, as we've heard from that side in particular. Like all religions, Islam is a supermarket of ideas, of instructions and exhortations that good men can select according to their appetites. The trouble is that bad men can select according to their own appetites too. The trouble with Islam is that, as we've heard at considerable length on this side of the house, is that for some reason, though, although it professes peace and has generated art and literature of exquisite beauty, so giving peace to the sensitive soul, which was one of the barbs that were thrown across to our side of the house, it does in practice seem to inspire violence rather more openly than the other Abrahamic religions. And indeed, thinking about what Mehdi has just said, all the terrorists who were mentioned were Islamic terrorists. That, I think, is something that you should take on board. My colleagues have catalogued a number of its iniquities, and I shall not add to them, for the unspeakable speaks for itself. I would add, however, that when in a few minutes you come to consider how you will vote this evening, then you should not weigh good and evil equally in the balance. It is the case that one evil outweighs one good many times over. For loss of life, inhibition of aspiration, barbaric punishment and imposition, and intellectual stifling, cannot be assuaged by acts of hospitality, however generous. All the seas incarnadine cannot wash blood from a religion's hands by an act of piety. The evils will have destroyed a human life, as they did yesterday, and that life cannot be restored by charity. For every evil act inspired by Islam, even though the perpetrator is regarded by the rest of Islam as a deviant, 10, 100 or 1,000 inspired good deeds are not enough compensation. Now, as we've agreed, Islam seems peculiarly suited to the inspiration of violence. It's responding to your challenge earlier this evening at the beginning of the debate. It's appropriate to explore why. For then, no, I can't. For then, we might be able to see that far from being a religion of peace, it is intrinsically and ineluctably one where the opposite of peace, whether that be violence or other forms of peace, is woven into its very fabric, what was alluded to as the golden threads of the fabric earlier today. I might interpolate here, as has been suggested by this side of the House, that by identifying the threads of evil in its fabric, a new prophet, guided by the whisperings of a latter-day Gabriel, might be able to generate a new Islam, let's call it Islam 2.0, in which the glories that the proposers have so eloquently identified this evening are dominant and unsullied. Islam 2.0 would then rightfully be regarded as a religion of peace. But tonight we have before us only Islam 1.0, and it is that version that you must base your judgment on. The West, I will, in order to be conciliatory, the West is perhaps a tiny degree responsible. I will refer to the West and accept some responsibility for the excesses of Islam, but not for its intrinsic character. The West, with its liberal and encouraging attitude towards fellow man and man's intellectual achievement, has perhaps been too hasty in its aim to share its enlightenment. That impatient haste has been perceived as cultural imperialism and has fanned the embers of discontent into sometimes flaming hatred. The West's joy at stumbling into the Enlightenment and its impatient zeal to liberate minds and share personal liberty as soon as possible has perhaps encouraged the seeds of evil in Islam to flourish. But Islam itself must take responsibility for those seeds. It would be a brave man, of course, who said anything against the purity and brilliance of the Prophet, of course, and I must vehemently dissociate myself from the views of the infidel scholars that I am about to share. There are three issues that those disgraceful and disrespectful Enlightenment liberated scholars so scurrilously identify. One is that Muhammad, if it is in fact true that he ever existed, was a robber baron, perhaps a psychopath, possibly a schizophrenic, and certainly a warrior who made his pronouncements in time of war. Although, of course, none of that can possibly be true. Were it to be true, it would account for the bloodthirsty surahs that pervade the Quran and are found in the Hadiths, and the sense that copious bloodshed is the characteristic of a prophet. We only have to look to the modern mafia, the same scurrilous scholars say, to see how control is exercised by barbarity. My second issue is to remind you that if you take the view that the litmus test of the propagation of peace is the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then Islam, in the view of many of those same scurrilous scholars, is a desert. Article 1 says that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Islam, think of the misogyny of Islam. Take Article 5. No one shall be punishable by torture or cruel punishment. Contrast that with Islam's indulgence in amputation, stoning, and flogging. Take Article 18. Everyone has the right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and may choose their religion. Contrast that with the punishment for apostasy in Islam, which is death.
Point of information.
No. My third and final, and I think most important point, is that if you take the view that peace stems from a reflective ethics that acknowledges changing times, then Islam, based as it is on the frozen, unquestionable statements of the Quran, is wholly alien to intelligent, rational, reflective civilization.
Point of information.
Nope. Scholars point out that the rules of Islamic law are valid by virtue of their mere existence, not because of their rationality or their sensitivity to progress. Islam, they say, is a religion without ethics, for ethics necessarily involves the questioning of foundations, which Islam forbids. Ethics is intrinsic to good government, and good government is intrinsic to peace.
Point of information.
Strike away ethics, and it follows that you strike away the pursuit.
Ethics as well as no peace.
I'm not taking the point. Strike away ethics, and it follows that you strike away the pursuit and propagation of peace. This evening you've seen both sides of a vision of Islam. This side of the House has gladly conceded that good men will find good things in it, as good men will find anywhere. But we, through examples of the behavior that Islam inspires and often condones, and I, by seeking to show that Islam has an intrinsic fault, long for Islam 2.0. Islam 2.0, Islam's enlightenment, will have an emphasis on humanity, subtlety, harmony, and reason, and be virtuous.
On that point.
This evening, though, you are judging Islam 1.0, not Islam 2.0. By opposing the motion, you will be encouraging the emergence of what most of humanity really longs for, but for which does not yet exist. Please, for the sake of humanity, oppose.